Welcome to the Big Four Accounting Firms podcast, brought to you by big4accountingfirms.com and the Big Four Accounting Firms YouTube channel. Before we get started, just wanted to remind everybody to support us if you have a chance or if you can. Even $1 helps, and we have a link in the description to a website called Buy Me a Coffee. It's just a way to donate to us and support us. Again, any amount is helpful so that we can keep putting out content. And there's also other ways for you to support us in the show notes to this podcast or on YouTube in the description.
In today's podcast, we're going to talk about E&Y facing a pretty big lawsuit. And this relates to them concealing fraud at NMC Health related to an audit. And it's kind of weird because it was a hospital and the founder is the one that's suing E&Y. A guy by the name of Bhavaguthu Shetty, and he's seeking $7 billion because he says that E&Y was helping actively conceal a 6-year fraud from investors, and obviously as a founder he would be an investor, and investors lost more than $10 billion in total, but this guy specifically is looking to get back $7 billion. I mean, we hear about this all the time. There's a lot of news companies talking about this and saying how E&Y is facing multiple lawsuits, but I mean the audit firms are always facing multiple lawsuits at once. But what's interesting me here is the allegations. He says that E&Y went from being a pliable auditor that performed soft audits to an active co-conspirator. So basically saying, and typically the auditors or E&Y was a soft auditor, but this time they actively were involved in it. And I guess that's how he's going to get the money from them, or thinks he's going to get the money from them. But some of the allegations are very interesting. He says that the E&Y never questioned financial figures and rubber stamped the audit certificates. Any arm's length review would have spotted red flags, including thousands of transactions shuttled between group companies. And on one occasion, E&Y certified account balances. And on one occasion, E&Y certified account balances at a group company without receiving the corresponding bank statements. And another time, E&Y was sent spreadsheets for the entire year of 2019, even though the document was prepared in September. It wasn't even the end of the year. There's former executives that forged this Shetty guy's signature on 127 guarantees, which were tied to billions of dollars in loans, and lenders are now seeking repayment on those loans. And there's also payments that were made to executives and board members, and these were just kickbacks, is what the founder is alleging. And this is also comes on the heels of apparently NMC's administrators in London are also filing a lawsuit against E&Y. And E&Y is also under investigation in the UK by the FRC. So there's a lot going on here for E&Y, but I think it lays out a good path of what not to do at the Big Four accounting firms if you're a staff person. And I mean, this happens all the time where these rubber stamps, but how do you get to a rubber stamp? Well, you have to make sure that you get bank statements before you sign off on stuff. You have to make sure that you actually look at them. You have to look at what the banks send you and see if you can use it as audit support. Not even investigating spreadsheets with sales figures. I mean, this happens a lot in the Big Four accounting firms where you just sent support. It's the same as prior year and you just shove it in the file and move on, especially if you don't train your young employees. I think it's just getting worse and worse. And I think just with technology, everything's moving a little bit more rapidly, and it's becoming more obvious what the Big Four accounting firms do and don't do because everything's held electronically, so they can't necessarily have these huge paper files anymore where they can just hide the lack of work that they did. He alleges that there's thousands of transactions that were not audited. I mean, Big Four accounting firms aren't really good at transactional level detail. They don't necessarily audit down to that threshold, but I understand what he's saying. There's other things in place that should be covering for this, like controls and looking at balances and things that make sense. asking questions, actually being involved. And here it sounds like everything was very high level. But I don't think this is out of the norm because we hear about these stories constantly about companies going under. So it's I've spoken about this on here before a lot about just things that need to get done, specifically with regards to cash and bank statements. But I don't think it's just the big four accounting firms that need to be held responsible. And I don't think they are the only ones held responsible. It needs to also be the banks. And I think the banks have to be a big part of it. There has to be more work done by the banks to flag transactions, find out like commonalities between all these companies where fraud occurs and where people steal money and do kickbacks. There has to be things like this that are seen at the banks and where the banks stop it. Now I know there's controls at banks that are supposed to prevent crime, but there needs to be more that, especially for large public companies, that prevent fraud, like certain things that can't happen. So I think it's people keep going after the big four accounting firms because they're professionals that are supposed to be reviewing and auditing. But I think it's also the banks. The big four accounting firms at this point are there to look at, I mean, based on what the work that they're doing that we see in these failures is there just to look at accounting principles. It seems like actually looking at the numbers and the figures in there, they're not good at, and verifying them, they're good at looking at the accounting principles. They're not good at actually verifying the balances actually are there in the bank statement and assets, things like that. So I think at this point, the regulators, they can keep regulating the big four accounting firms to death, but at some point they need to get involved at the banks and vendors and things like that and go after the executives as well. So that's the podcast for today. Make sure to subscribe, stay up to date, and check out the description to find other ways that you can help us. Thanks for listening.